Imagine you are a sailor on an ancient warship, the wind is howling, the enemy is closing in, and you are prepared for the rain of arrows, the crash of spears, and the flames of fire pots. You brace for impact. But then, a clay pot shatters at your feet. You expect fire, you expect smoke. Instead, you look down and see the glistening, coiled body of a deadly viper staring back at you. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the deck of your ship is no longer a battlefield, it has become a writhing pit of snakes. This is not a scene from a fantasy novel, this was a real military strategy executed by one of the greatest enemies Rome ever faced. A general so desperate, so cunning, that he turned the most feared reptiles on the planet into biological weapons. Welcome to A Forgotten Dominion. Today we tell the story of the man who fought Rome with snakes. To understand how a naval battle ended up covered in serpents, we have to look at the man behind the madness, Hannibal Barca. By the time of our story, Hannibal was already a legend. He was the Carthaginian general who had pulled off the impossible crossing the Alps with war elephants to attack the Roman Republic from its own backyard. He had humiliated Rome at the Battle of Cannae, surrounding and slaughtering a much larger army. For years, the phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, was used by Roman parents to scare their children. He was public enemy number one, but Rome never forgot, and they never forgot, and they never forgave. Eventually, after years of hunting him, they forced him into exile. Hannibal, the master of the battlefield, became a man without a country, wandering from kingdom to kingdom, always one step ahead of Roman assassins. He eventually found refuge in a place you might not expect, the kingdom of Bithynia in what is modern day Turkey. The king there, Prusias I, had a problem, and he needed a monster to solve it. The year is approximately of 4 BCE. Bithynia was at war with its powerful neighbor Pergamon. Pergamon was the stronger of the two. Its king, Eumenes II, was a smart politician. He was best friends with the rising superpower of the region, Rome. This gave him confidence, resources, and a massive fleet. On paper, the coming battle was a joke. When the two navies prepared to meet, the Bithynian fleet was heavily outnumbered. Historians like Cornelius Nepos recorded that the enemy fleet was incredibly strong. Some accounts mention facing a fleet of over 400 ships. Prusias looked at his own ships, then looked at the experienced aging general hiding out in his court. He turned to Hannibal and said, "You beat Rome. Surely you can beat these guys." Hannibal gave the order, "Do not sharpen your swords, do not fletch your arrows, go to the marshes, go to the rocky hillsides, and catch me every snake you can find." His men must have thought he had lost his mind, but they obeyed. For days, the Bithynian soldiers became snake catchers. They were looking specifically for venomous species like vipers such as the Viperia ammodites, the nose-horned viper, which is aggressive and deadly, common in that region. But here is the question modern historians and herpetologists have asked: could they really catch enough to make a difference? At first glance, it seems impossible. Venomous snakes are usually solitary, but recent research suggests it might have been easier than we think. If it was spring, snakes would be emerging from hibernation, sometimes congregating in higher numbers. There is a species called the dye snake in that region. While mostly harmless, they gather in huge numbers near water sources. Herpetologists have noted that in the right habitat, hundreds could be collected in just a few hours. Whether they were all deadly vipers or a mix of scary looking but harmless snakes, Hannibal didn't care. He just needed them to be scary. Once captured, the snakes were stuffed into large clay pots. The pots were sealed, trapping the furious reptiles inside. Imagine the sound: thousands of pots, each one hissing and rattling, loaded onto the decks of the Bithynian ships. The stage was set for the most bizarre naval battle in history. The Pergamene fleet under King Eumenes II sailed confidently toward the Bithynians. They expected a standard fight. They saw the Bithynian ships holding back, seemingly afraid to engage. Eumenes likely smiled. His superior numbers would crush them. He gave the signal to advance. But as his ships came within range, Hannibal didn't order a boarding charge. He didn't order flaming arrows. He pointed forward and yelled one word: fire. But it wasn't fire that flew through the air, it was clay. catapults, and onagers torsion-powered artillery, usually used to throw rocks, were aimed low, and they launched these clay pots onto the decks of the Pergamene ships. At first, the Pergamene sailors laughed. The pots broke open, but there was no explosion, no fire, just dirt and dust. And then the dust began to move. The first scream rang out. A sailor pointed at the deck. A viper, dazed but angry, was uncoiling from the shards of a pot. Then another, then 10, then hundreds. Within minutes, decks of the Pergamene warships turned into a living nightmare. Men who had trained their whole lives to fight other men had no idea how to fight snakes. You cannot parry a snake with a sword, you cannot block a snake with a shield. Sailors dropped their weapons, rowers abandoned their oars, officers screamed orders, but no one was listening because everyone was running. Some men jumped overboard rather than face the fangs, others retreated to the rigging, trapped like birds as the snakes explored the lower decks. The tight, confined space of a warship, which was usually an advantage for boarding actions, became a death trap. Panic is contagious, and in the ancient world, snakes were seen as creatures of the underworld, touched by magic and death. King Eumenes II watched in horror as his mighty fleet fell into chaos. His ships weren't sinking, but they were dead in the water, crewed by madmen. Only then did Hannibal give the order to attack. The Bithynian fleet moved in for the kill. They faced almost no resistance. They easily boarded the enemy ships, pushing the terrified sailors aside. Eumenes II barely escaped with his life. It was a stunning, impossible victory. Hannibal had won again. He had defeated a superior force, not with steel, but with psychology. But here is the tragedy of Hannibal. Even this brilliant victory could not save him. Rome had not forgotten their old enemy. When they heard that Hannibal was advising the king of Bithynia, they sent a delegation. They demanded his surrender. King Prusias, the man Hannibal had just saved, was weak. Fearing the wrath of Rome, he agreed to betray his guest. He sent soldiers to surround Hannibal's hiding place. Hannibal, the old lion, looked out the window and saw he was trapped. He was in his 60s. He had outrun Rome for decades. But now there was no escape. It is said he took out a small vial. He always carried with him a vial of poison. He reportedly sighed and spoke his last words. Let us release the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too long to wait for an old man to die. In 183 BCE, Hannibal drank the poison and died. The man who had used snakes to terrorize his enemies was finally killed by a different kind of venom. But was the snake battle actually real? Did this really happen? The primary source for this comes from the Roman writer Sextus Julius Frontinus, who wrote a book called Stratagema, a collection of military tactics. He credits Hannibal with this exact plan. Later writers like Cornelius Nepos and Aulus Gellius kept the story alive. For the Romans, this story served a purpose. It showed that even in exile, Hannibal was a dangerous, cunning, and almost sorcerous breed. Some skeptics point out that we don't have Bithynian records of the event they lost the war. After all, and history is written by the victors. But the fact that Roman writers kept this story even as a warning to their own commanders suggests it holds a kernel of truth. The details are too specific. The logistics are, as we've learned, actually plausible. Hannibal remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if he had taken Rome? What if he had more support? His snake bombs didn't change the course of the empire, but they proved a universal truth. In war, the mind is the first thing to conquer, and sometimes the smallest, quietest creature can bring the mightiest warrior to his knees. Thank you for watching For Good and Dominion. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient biological warfare, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments